March 1943. Inside the operations room at RAF Bomber Command headquarters in High Wycombe, England, Air Marshal Arthur Harris stared at numbers that spelled disaster. The latest loss reports lay spread across his desk like a death sentence written in careful typewriter letters. 5.2%. That was the percentage of bombers that never came home from the last major raid over Germany. For every 100 aircraft that took off into the dark English sky, more than 5 were shot down by German night fighters before they could return. The math was brutal and simple. At this rate, Bomber Command would run out of trained crews before Christmas. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and stale coffee. Maps covered every wall, marked with red pins showing target cities across Germany. Each pin represented hundreds of tons of bombs dropped, but also dozens of young men who never came back. Harris rubbed his tired eyes and listened to the sounds filtering through the building. Typewriters clacked in nearby offices. Phones rang with reports from airfields across England. Somewhere down the hall, someone was crying. Another crew reported missing, another telegram to be sent to families who would never see their sons again. The problem was clear to everyone in that room. German radar had changed everything. Their Lichtenstein airborne radars could spot British bombers from miles away in the pitch-black night. Their Würzburg ground stations guided night fighters right to the bomber streams with deadly accuracy. The Germans had turned the night sky into a killing zone, and British bombers were dying in numbers that made Harris sick to his stomach. Just last week, a raid on Berlin had lost 43 aircraft out of 800. That was over 5% gone in a single night. The week before, Hamburg had cost them 37 bombers. The numbers kept climbing, and no one knew how to stop it. British bomber crews followed the rules they had been taught. Since training, they flew in tight formations for mutual protection. They maintained steady altitudes to avoid collisions in the dark. They followed carefully planned routes that took them to their targets and back. They did everything by the book, everything their commanders told them to do. And they died anyway. The German controllers could predict exactly where the bomber streams would fly, because the British did the same thing every single time. Intelligence reports brought disturbing news from decoded German radio messages. The enemy radar operators were identifying different bomber groups by their flight patterns. Disciplined and predictable, one German report said. Easy to track and engage. Into this crisis came the Canadians. Number 6, group of the Royal Canadian Air Force had just formed in January 1943. These were crews from across Canada, farm boys from Saskatchewan and loggers from British Columbia, factory workers from Ontario and fishermen from Nova Scotia. They arrived. In England, with a reputation that made the British officers nervous, the Canadians had a different way of doing things. They asked questions. They challenged orders. They wanted to know why things were done a certain way instead of just following along. Air Marshal Harris was not impressed. He had spent his entire career in the Royal Air Force, where discipline and following orders were everything. These colonial cowboys from Canada seemed more interested in arguing than fighting. During briefings, Canadian pilots asked uncomfortable questions. Why did they have to fly the same routes every time? Why couldn't they vary their altitude more? Why did formation discipline matter more than survival? Harris and his staff had the same answer every time. This was how precision bombing worked. This was how the RAF had always operated. Discipline won wars, not individual creativity. The Canadian squadron commanders saw something different when they looked at those same loss reports. They saw crews doing exactly what they were told and dying for it. They saw young men following orders that got them killed. Several officers began studying the intelligence summaries late into the night, looking for patterns in the losses. They noticed that German controllers could identify bomber formations by how predictable they were. The British flew like machines, precise and unchanging. The Germans had learned to shoot down machines. One evening, in the officers' mess at RCAF Station Leeming, several Canadian squadron commanders sat around a scarred wooden table. The room was loud with conversation and the clink of glasses, but their corner was quiet and serious. They had just come back from a briefing where an RAF group captain had lectured them on maintaining proper formation discipline. Squadron leader Keith Hodson of 428 Squadron shook his head slowly. He was a soft-spoken man from Alberta who had flown 23 missions and watched too many friends die. "The Germans know exactly what we're going to do," he said quietly, "because we do the same thing every time." The other officers nodded. They had all seen it. British bombers flew like they were on parade, straight and level and perfectly predictable. The German night fighters loved it. They could set up their attacks knowing exactly where the bombers would be and exactly what they would do. It was like shooting targets at a carnival booth, except the targets were filled with young men who would never see their families again. Wing Commander Bill Pleasance of 420 Squadron leaned forward. He was older than most bomber pilots, a former bush pilot who had flown mining surveys over northern Ontario before the war. "What if we stop being so damn predictable?" he asked. The question hung in the smoky air like a challenge to everything they had been taught. What if survival mattered more than formation discipline? What if staying alive meant breaking the rules? The first crews to try something different did it, quietly, without asking permission. On a cold night in late March 1943, Flight Lieutenant Dave Shannon took his Halifax bomber up for a raid on Hamburg. His crew was nervous. They had talked about this for hours in their barracks, arguing in whispers so no one would overhear. Shannon had decided they were going to fly differently than everyone else. Instead of holding a steady altitude of 20,000 feet, like the book said, they were going to move up and down like a boat on rough water. Instead of flying straight and level, they were going to weave and turn. The navigator, a young man from Toronto named Jimmy Walsh, had plotted their route with built-in deviations. Every 10 minutes, they would shift course by 5 to 10 degrees. Every 15 minutes, they would climb or dive by 2,000 feet. It meant more work for Walsh, constantly recalculating their position. It meant more work for the pilot, constantly adjusting the controls instead of just holding them steady. But it also meant the German radar operators would have a harder time predicting where they would be. That night over Hamburg, Shannon pushed his bomber up and down through the dark sky like he was riding invisible hills. At one moment, they were at 22,000 feet. 5 minutes later, they had dropped to 18,000, then back up to 21,000. The German searchlight swept past them, always a little behind, always where they would have been if they had flown straight. The flak bursts exploded in clusters where a normal bomber stream would be flying, but Shannon's Halifax was somewhere else, higher or lower, off to one side. His wireless operator reported hearing confused German voices on the radio, controllers trying to vector night fighters to targets that kept disappearing from their scopes. They made it home that night. So did most of the other Canadian crews who had tried the same tactics. When they compared notes the next morning over breakfast in the mess hall, the results were striking. Out of 42 Canadian aircraft that had flown to Hamburg, only one had been lost. That was 2.8%. The RAF squadrons flying the same mission had lost 19 aircraft out of 312. That was 6.1%, more than twice as many. Word spread quickly among the Canadian squadrons. Crews started calling it wild flying, though some used less polite terms. They varied their speed too, throttling back to 160 miles per hour, then pushing up to 220. The German night fighters were trained to match speeds with bombers flying at a steady 190 miles per hour. When a Canadian bomber suddenly slowed down or sped up, the German pilot would overshoot or fall behind, losing precious seconds while trying to reposition for an attack. The tactics were simple but exhausting. Pilots had to stay alert every second, constantly adjusting altitude and heading. Navigators had to recalculate positions over and over, working by dim red light while the aircraft bounced and swayed. Gunners had to be ready for attacks from any angle because the evasive flying meant they were no longer protected by the formation around them. But crews who flew this way kept coming home when others did not. RAF Bomber Command was not pleased. In early April, a stiffly worded memo arrived at all Canadian squadron headquarters. The tactics being employed by certain crews were deemed undisciplined and dangerous to formation integrity. Bombers that strayed from their assigned altitudes and routes created collision hazards. They disrupted the carefully planned bomber stream. They made it harder for Pathfinder aircraft to mark targets accurately. The memo ordered all crews to maintain proper formation discipline and follow assigned flight plans exactly. Many Canadian crews ignored the order. They had seen the results. They knew what worked. When Group Captain Clifford McEwen, known to everyone as Black Mike because of his dark hair and fierce temper, heard about crews being threatened with discipline for wild flying, he started keeping careful records. McEwen was a decorated pilot who commanded the Canadian bomber base at Middleton, St. George. He was stubborn and detail-oriented, the kind of officer who believed in facts more than regulations. McEwen had his intelligence officers compile loss statistics for every raid. He documented which squadrons used wild flying and which followed standard procedures. He recorded German radio intercepts that mentioned Canadian aircraft. He built a case with numbers that could not be argued away. His files grew thick with evidence that the unorthodox tactics were saving lives. The real test came on April 19th during a major raid on Würzburg, an industrial city deep in Germany's Ruhr Valley. It was a maximum effort mission, with over 400 bombers taking part. Number 6 group sent 118 Canadian aircraft. The rest came from RAF squadrons flying standard tactics. The night was clear with a bright moon, perfect conditions for German night fighters. The Canadian crews flew wild. They varied altitude by 2,000 feet or more, climbing and diving through the darkness. They deviated from the main bomber stream by as much as 15 miles, taking different routes to the target. Each pilot made his own decisions about when to climb or turn, using his judgment instead of following rigid orders. The formations looked ragged and undisciplined to anyone watching from the ground. The results were undeniable. When the aircraft returned to their bases and the losses were counted, 4 Canadian bombers had been shot down out of 118. That was 3.4%. The RAF squadrons lost 23 aircraft out of 312. That was 7.4%, more than twice the Canadian rate. In a single night, the wild flying tactics had cut losses by more than half. McEwen sent his report to Bomber Command headquarters the next morning. He included exact numbers, radio intercepts, and detailed accounts from returning crews. He argued that the evidence was clear and overwhelming. The tactics worked. They cost nothing to implement because they used the same aircraft and the same crews. All it required was permission to let pilots use their judgment instead of following rigid formations. The report landed on desks in High Wycombe and was met with silence. No one wanted to admit that colonial crews with unorthodox methods were achieving better results than the established RAF doctrine, but the numbers were there in black and white, impossible to ignore. 4 lost instead of 9. 3.4% instead of 7.4. Over 100 young men who came home because their pilots had refused to fly predictably. Without asking permission or waiting for new equipment, the Canadians had proven their point with the only evidence that mattered. They had found a way to come home alive. By the summer of 1943, the difference between Canadian and British bomber losses had become too large to ignore. Black Mike McEwen's carefully kept records showed a pattern that repeated itself raid after raid. In May, Canadian squadrons averaged 3.9% losses while the rest of Bomber Command lost 5.8%. In June, the gap widened further. Canadian crews flying their wild, unpredictable patterns were coming home at rates that made the standard tactics look like suicide missions. The numbers told a story written in survival and death. If those loss rates held for an entire year, they meant the difference between life and death for nearly 2,000 young men. Every percentage point represented dozens of families who would receive their sons back instead of folding flags. Every raid where Canadians lost 2 aircraft instead of 5 meant 14 crew members who would see another. Sunrise! The mathematics of survival were brutally simple, and the wild flying tactics were winning. German radio intercepts began telling another part of the story. British intelligence officers who listened to enemy transmissions started noticing frustrated comments about Canadian bombers. One German night fighter controller was recorded saying, "Those were the Canadians again, impossible to track." Another German pilot reported to his base, "Target maneuvered erratically, could not maintain firing position." The word erratic appeared over and over in German reports about engagements with Canadian aircraft. The Luftwaffe defenders had learned to recognize them by how unpredictable they were. A captured German radar operator, interviewed in a prisoner of war camp in August 1943, provided more details. He described his frustration trying to guide night fighters to Canadian bombers. "They flew like drunk men walking," he said through an interpreter. "Just when you thought you knew where they would be, they would climb or dive or turn. Our fighters would arrive at the intercept point and find nothing. The Canadians made our whole system less effective." The Canadians themselves started to notice how differently German defenders reacted to their aircraft. Gunners reported that when FW-190 or Me-1110 night fighters did find them, the attacks took longer to develop. The German pilots seemed uncertain, hesitant to commit to firing passes because the Canadian bombers kept changing position. Crews timed the encounters and found that German fighters took an average of 30% longer to set up attacks against aircraft using wild flying compared to bombers flying straight and level. Those extra seconds often meant the difference between a successful evasion and a coffin falling from the sky. But not everyone was convinced. The RAF Pathfinder Force, the elite squadrons that marked targets for the main bomber stream, refused to adopt the Canadian tactics. Their commander, Air Vice Marshal Donald Bennett, argued that precision target marking required strict formation discipline. Pathfinder aircraft had to arrive over the target at exact times and exact altitudes to drop their colored flares in the right places. Bennett claimed that wild flying would scatter the markers across miles of German countryside and make accurate bombing impossible. Bennett's objection had some merit for the specialized Pathfinder role, but it ignored the fact that regular bomber crews did not need the same precision. Their job was to survive the journey to the target, drop their bomb somewhere in the general area lit by the Pathfinder flares, and make it home alive. For them, formation discipline was killing more crews than it was helping. Other RAF officers raised different objections. They worried about mid-air collisions if every aircraft was climbing and diving independently through the dark sky. They argued that individual crews could not be trusted to make their own tactical decisions. They claimed that discipline and order had always been the foundation of British military success. Letting crews do whatever they wanted would lead to chaos and disaster. The Canadians had an answer to every objection. Mid-air collisions were rare because the wild flying actually spread aircraft out more, creating more space between them instead of packing them into tight, vulnerable formations. Crews were not doing whatever they wanted. They were following a clear tactical doctrine that emphasized unpredictability within safe limits. And as for discipline, the Canadians argued that staying alive to fight another day was the most disciplined thing a crew could do. The clearest comparison came from looking at what happened to bomber groups that tried other solutions to the German night fighter problem. Some RAF squadrons experimented with new equipment, installing additional guns or armor plating. The extra weight made the aircraft slower and easier to catch. Other groups tried flying higher, above 25,000 feet, where the thin air made it harder for German fighters to operate. But the lack of oxygen at those altitudes exhausted crews and reduced bombing accuracy. And the German fighters learned to climb higher too. One RAF group tried the opposite approach, flying very low to sneak under German radar. The low-level flights avoided radar detection but brought the bombers within range of tens of thousands of anti-aircraft guns that turned the sky into a wall of exploding steel. The losses from flak were worse than the losses from night fighters had been. None of these alternative solutions worked as well as the simple Canadian tactic of being unpredictable. Inside the Canadian bombers themselves, crews were experiencing another unexpected benefit of the wild flying. The constant navigation challenges were making them better at their jobs. Navigators who had to recalculate their position every few minutes became experts at dead reckoning, and map reading. Pilots who constantly adjusted altitude and heading developed finer control skills. Wireless operators who monitored German radio frequencies learned to recognize patterns in enemy communications. The wild flying was not just keeping them alive, it was making them into superior air crews. The sensory experience of a Canadian bomber over Germany on a summer night in 1943 was completely different from a standard RAF mission. Inside the Halifax or Lancaster, the crew worked in organized chaos. The pilot's hands never stopped moving on the control column, pushing forward to dive, pulling back to climb, banking left, then right. The engines roared louder as the aircraft climbed, then quieted as it descended. The navigator hunched over his maps under a tiny light, penciling in new calculations while his instruments swayed and bounced. The wireless operator listened through his headphones to the frustrated German voices trying to find them. The gunners swiveled, their turrets constantly searching the darkness for the telltale exhaust flames of an approaching fighter. Outside the aircraft, the night sky was a landscape of death. Searchlight beams swept back and forth like the fingers of blind giants trying to grab them. Flak bursts bloomed in orange flowers of fire and shrapnel, always where the aircraft would have been if it had flown straight. Far below, German cities burned with fires that could be seen from 100 miles away. Around them in the darkness, other bombers droned through the night, some flying the old way in neat formations, some weaving and diving like the Canadians. And everywhere, invisible in the black sky, German night fighters prowled looking for victims. By the end of August 1943, No. 6 Group had flown thousands of sorties using wild flying tactics. Their overall loss rate for the summer had stabilized at just under 4%, while comparable RAF groups were losing close to 6%. The Canadian approach had spread informally to some British squadrons whose crews had talked to Canadian friends and decided to try the tactics themselves. No official order had authorized the change. No manual had been written explaining the techniques. It had spread the way truth spreads, through crews who wanted to live, sharing what worked with other crews who wanted to live. The full scale of what the Canadians had achieved would not be clear until after the war, but the pattern was already visible. They had changed how bomber crews thought about survival. They had proven that individual skill and judgment could matter more than rigid obedience to formation rules. And they had done it all without a single new piece of equipment, without a single pound of additional funding, without anything except the courage to question whether the old ways were the best ways. Those were the Canadians, and they had troubled the German air defenses, not with superior technology, but with superior thinking. For the next 2 years, Canadian bomber crews continued flying their unpredictable patterns over Germany. Through the terrible losses of the Battle of Berlin in the winter of 1943, through the devastating raids on German oil refineries in 1944, through the final crushing blows of 1945, they kept coming home at rates that proved their tactics worked. When the war ended in May 1945, Canadian bomber crews had flown 40,822 combat sorties. Military analysts sat down in quiet offices after the victory parades had finished, and the cheering crowds had gone home to begin the careful work of counting costs and measuring effectiveness. They pulled files from archives and compared loss rates across different groups and different time periods. They interviewed surviving crew members and read through thousands of mission reports. The numbers they compiled told a story that vindicated everything the Canadian crews had done. The statistical analysis showed that wild flying tactics had saved approximately 1,200 Canadian lives during the last 2 years of the war. That number came from comparing actual Canadian loss rates with the rates they would have experienced if they had flown like standard RAF squadrons. 1,200 young men who walked away from their final missions and went home to farms in Alberta, and fishing boats in Nova Scotia, and factories in Ontario. 1,200 families who did not receive telegrams beginning with the words, "We regret to inform you." 1,200 lives that continued because some pilots had decided to stop being predictable. The analysts also discovered something the Canadians themselves had not fully realized during the war. The wild flying had not just protected individual crews, it had forced the entire German night fighter system to become less efficient. German controllers had to spend more time and resources tracking every aircraft instead of simply predicting where the bomber stream would be. Fighters wasted fuel searching for targets that had moved to different altitudes. Radar operators became more cautious about their intercept vectors, knowing that Canadian bombers might not be where the calculations said they should be. The psychological effect rippled through the entire German air defense network, making everything work just a little bit worse. By 1946, the wild flying tactics had been quietly incorporated into standard bomber command training under a different name. They called it fighter affiliation training now, which sounded more official and less like something rebellious colonials had invented. New pilots learned to vary their altitude and heading. They practiced evasive maneuvers and unpredictable flight patterns. The techniques that Canadian crews had developed through trial and error and desperation became part of the official manual that every bomber pilot studied. No one mentioned that the tactics had once been called undisciplined and dangerous. History had a way of forgetting the resistance once something proved successful. The wild flying concept evolved into something even larger in post-war military thinking. By the 1950s, tactical aviation doctrine in air forces around the world had absorbed a fundamental lesson that the Canadians had demonstrated over the night skies of Germany. Predictability is vulnerability. Those three words appeared in training manuals from the United States Air Force, the Royal Air Force, and air forces of dozens of other nations. Military theorists wrote papers about the importance of tactical flexibility and individual initiative. They cited studies and ran calculations and built elaborate theories. But the core truth was simple and had been proven by Canadian bomber crews who refused to die on schedule. Black Mike McEwen received recognition that many others did not. After the war, he was promoted through the ranks of the Royal Canadian Air Force until he became Chief of the Air Staff, the highest position in the Canadian military aviation hierarchy. He served with distinction and retired with honors. His name appeared in official histories and his contributions were noted in government documents. He had championed the wild flying tactics when doing so was unpopular, and he had kept meticulous records that proved their effectiveness. His reward was a successful career and the knowledge that he had been right. But many of the squadron commanders and individual pilots who had actually developed and refined the tactics received nothing special. Flight Lieutenant Dave Shannon, who had been one of the first to try flying unpredictably over Hamburg, finished the war as a squadron leader and went home to work in his father's hardware store in Winnipeg. Wing Commander Bill Pleasance, who had asked the dangerous question about stopping being so predictable, retired from the Air Force in 1946 and went back to flying bush planes in northern Ontario. Squadron leader Keith Hodson, who had observed that the Germans knew what they were going to do because they did the same thing every time, returned to his farm in Alberta and rarely talked about the war. These men and hundreds like them had changed how bomber crews survived, but history did not carve their names on monuments or print their faces on postage stamps. They had simply done their jobs and tried to stay alive and help their friends do the same. The official recognition went to the senior officers who had eventually endorsed their methods, while the crews who had risked court-martial by ignoring orders slipped back into civilian life and were largely forgotten. The influence of Canadian tactical innovation reached far beyond bombing doctrine. Post-war fighter pilots adopted the principle that rigid formations made easy targets. Helicopter pilots in later conflicts learned to vary their approach patterns to landing zones. Even naval aviators flying from aircraft carriers incorporated random elements into their flight paths when operating in hostile airspace. The idea that had started with desperate bomber crews over Germany became a foundational concept across all military aviation. Individual initiative and tactical flexibility were no longer seen as threats to discipline, but as essential tools for survival. Decades later, in the age of computers and artificial intelligence, military planners discovered that the Canadian approach remained relevant in unexpected ways. AI-guided weapon systems in the 21st century were designed to predict where targets would be based on their past behavior. They analyzed flight patterns and calculated intercept courses with perfect mathematical precision, but they struggled with targets that behaved unpredictably. A fighter jet that suddenly changed altitude for no apparent reason, or a bomber that varied its speed randomly created the same kind of targeting problems that had frustrated German radar operators 80 years earlier. The mathematics might be more sophisticated, but the principle remained the same. Predictable targets die. Unpredictable targets survive. The story of the Canadian bomber crews offers lessons that extend beyond military tactics. It reveals something fundamental about how innovation happens and where it comes from. The established experts at RAF Bomber Command had years of experience and prestigious educations and all the authority that came with rank and tradition, but they were trapped by their own expertise, unable to see beyond the methods that had always worked before. The Canadians were outsiders, colonial forces that the British establishment did not quite trust or respect. That outsider status became their advantage. They were not invested in proving that the old methods were correct. They were only invested in staying alive. Throughout history, breakthrough innovations have often come from people who were willing to question established wisdom because they had less to lose by being wrong. The insiders have reputations to protect and careers that depend on current methods being validated. The outsiders can afford to try something different because no one expects them to know better anyway. The colonial cowboys from Canada troubled the German air defenses because they refused to accept that young men had to die following rules that did not work. Their frontier mentality, dismissed as undisciplined by the British brass, was actually a willingness to adapt and experiment and learn from results rather than from tradition. The night skies over Germany in 1943 were a laboratory where every experiment was a matter of life and death. The Canadian crews ran those experiments every time they took off, testing what worked and abandoning what did not. They kept the tactics that brought them home and discarded the ones that got other crews killed. They built their knowledge not from textbooks or briefing rooms, but from lived experience at 20,000 feet with German fighters on their tails and searchlights sweeping the darkness below. What the story teaches us is that survival and innovation require the courage to be unpredictable, the wisdom to question authority when authority is wrong, and the humility to learn from results rather than assumptions. The Canadians were not smarter than the British or braver than other bomber crews. They were simply more willing to try something different when the old way was not working. That willingness, more than any advanced technology or superior resources, saved 1,200 lives and changed how military forces around the world thought about tactical operations. Those were the Canadians, and they proved that sometimes the best answer comes from the people brave enough to ask whether there might be a better way.